During this project, what was your title? What was your position?
And during this project, I was responsible for the interface between our hardware and the rest of the satellite. So it was about 300 pins of electrical connections between the two, power coming in, commands coming in, telling our equipment which position the stereo mirror should be in, when to start the camera, when to stop the camera, and all those kinds of things. And then there were sensors for virtually everything that was done to determine that it had been done as intended.
Right.
And make sure there weren't any problems, and if there were, that would help you try to decide how to cope with those problems when you have it on orbit. You can't make any adjustments.
Right. Can't make any adjustments while it's up there. So just in terms of my own clarification here. So you were an employee at Eastman Kodak at the time, which is the ones who were.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. So we'll back up just a little bit. Why don't you tell me about what this satellite actually did?
Well, the satellite would fly in a near polar orbit around. This gives you an opportunity, as the Earth turns underneath, it gives you an opportunity to see virtually any place on Earth. And the government would decide what was the most important target. They'd decide, so that would get turned into commands that would turn things on, open the doors, put the stereo mirror in the proper position, then run the camera. And for a length of time, sometimes taking a stereo shot, one forward-looking, one aft-looking, that way you can determine height of an object on the ground.
One thing that many of you talked about and the moderator asked about as well, it was a very young group of engineers assigned to this project. Talk to me about the working environment when you all were given this project. What was that like?
Well, it was exciting for somebody just recently out of college. I had only about 2 years with the company when this project started, so it was very exciting to be working on something that you could tell, I felt at least, was pretty important to be able to provide that kind of information to the government so that they could decide how to live through the Cold War, which was a scary time.
Yeah, and compounding with that, on top of that, you guys must have had so much stress with your job, really long hours in the job. How did you get through it?
One day at a time. It was long, very long hours, and it took a very understanding wife, and it was a challenge because, as was mentioned earlier, when we traveled, we weren't allowed to say where we were going because that would associate. If we were associated with the aerospace companies, it would be pretty obvious it was a photographic satellite because of who we worked for. So that was kept as a highly classified thing and had to travel incognito.
When you originally went to Kodak, did you think you'd be working on any classified projects like this? Something where you couldn't come home and talk about? Was that part of the deal, or is that something that just
I actually had a pretty good feel for that because they interviewed me and told me that in the interview that if I actually was offered more than one position within Kodak, and I elected to work on the one that they couldn't talk about.
Gotcha. In that vein of not being able to talk about it, I'm sure that must have been incredibly difficult, but now the project's been declassified. How did it feel to be able to talk to it again and be able to put your name on this project?
I've enjoyed it. I'm delighted that it happened. I wish it had happened earlier because there's some people that were deeply involved that unfortunately are no longer with us, and it would have been nice if it happened a little sooner, but classified information is classified information, and it has to stay that way until the government decides it's time to unclassify it.
So now that it has been unclassified, I actually had a chance to talk with James from the National Reconnaissance Office about this. They want to make sure that a project that is declassified, it comes back to a place where it has a historical tie. How does it feel to you to have this back here?
I think that's very thoughtful of them to have made the offer and to have found the planetarium as receptive as they are at the Museum and Science Center and the planetarium to have it here, and gives people an opportunity to show it to their grandchildren or whatever. I think that's just wonderful.
Talk to me about some of the emotions you feel when you see and you look at the camera optical assembly on display.
It brings back very fond memories and a lot of long nights. A lot of attention to detail. One of the secrets, I think, to success in space, almost any engineering program, is certainly one in where you're pushing the state of the art and the art isn't very well understood. There wasn't a lot of practice or history, was just to pay a tremendous amount of attention to the specific details of making sure each and every command got to exactly the right place. The instrumentation really measured what you wanted to measure.
Awesome. So whenever I interview interesting people, I like to ask them kind of like 3 bigger picture questions. Are you up for it?
Sure.
Cool. The first thing, it's always kind of a Rochester-based question. They talked about it a little bit at the press conference, but while you were working at Kodak, what made Rochester such a great place for a project like that to thrive?
It was access to all manner of people who had the knowledge, even if they weren't cleared for the program. If we had a question or a problem and we needed to get to somebody that was really expert in that area, it wasn't very difficult to gain time with the person, and you could the technical problems weren't per se so much classified. You could talk about a particular tech issue you were trying to solve without giving away why you wanted to know it.
Right. I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this question because it's kind of the whole basis for this interview, but what was the proudest accomplishment of your career working for Kodak?
This was, very
Why?
honestly.
Can you pick out like one specific reason why it's still at the top of the list for you?
Well, when they put the hardware together, our hardware, the hardware that General Electric was responsible for, the hardware that Lockheed was responsible for, we'd had a lot of meetings to talk about how it was all going to go together and make sure everything was all down on paper and done correctly. They put it together, it actually worked. It worked well.
Yeah.
Things weren't misaligned. What came over a given wire was what was expected to come over that wire. And when the government shared the fact with us that was about as clean an integration as they'd ever seen, that was a proud moment.
Beautiful. I love that. So one more for you. Do you have any advice for any aspiring engineer or scientist?
Get deeply involved in a project and pay attention to the details.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for your time, sir. I really appreciate it.